welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to have everybody here, friends, family, faculty, and of course our wonderful alumna Patricia Matamoros. This is the first of the 2024 spring sessions, and we look at these as an opportunity to speak with practitioners, alumni, industry leaders in a format that's a little bit more intimate, that allows students and visitors to really ask questions in a long form. And so Professor Roberto Rivera, I've been at FIU for quite a while, and it's wonderful to have you with us, Patricia. So I'll do the rundown of Patricia's highlights here. Patricia is the Resilience and Adaptation Lead at Sabino Miller Design Studio, great friends of the program, based here in Miami. And she has a background in both landscape architecture and architecture. And she's worked on some really important projects. We're going to talk about some of them. Here in Miami, the Barnacle Historic State Park Master Plan and the Miami Bay Walk, River Walk Design Guidelines. And these are really important because they set the tone for the long term. And I think our field really lends itself to thinking about that long term. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. Her advocacy for resilience and her experience in that area of our field is really important. She's worked on large-scale resiliency public spaces here in Miami. She's a very gifted public speaker, volunteer, and she takes action when it matters. So let's get started. And actually, you are the current Miami chair of the ASLA, American Society of Landscape Architects Florida chapter. So it's wonderful to have you with us, Patricia. So we're gonna kind of let the conversation go where it may, but I always find that it's really interesting. We have so many different routes that got us to landscape architecture. What is your story? What interested you in landscape architecture? Why landscape architecture?
So I first started in architecture. There's a background of architecture and appreciating architecture in my family. My grandpa was an architect and an urbanist in Venezuela. And so I decided to follow his steps. And in Venezuela and many places in Latin America and outside of the US, landscape architecture is not an independent career. It is an independent field, but you cannot study landscape architecture as an undergrad program. So I first studied architecture. I practiced as a licensed architect in Venezuela for many years. And I was always very interested in public space since the beginning of my studies, and how the architecture gets placed and how it creates public space around it and the pedestrian experience. So the more I learned about it and researched about it, I came up with landscape architecture, and I studied landscape architecture as a master's. I started studying landscape architecture in Venezuela, and you do it as a specialty.
So when you graduated in 2019 with your MLA, and clearly coming from Venezuela after studying as an architect and some landscape architecture, how did Miami, how did that come about? Why Florida, perhaps, or while you were here, why was this the right place for you, do you think?
That's really interesting. I kind of landed in Miami by chance. As a Venezuelan, we thought about moving out many times, and I never thought that Miami could be a possibility. But I do have some family here. Some of my uncles have lived in Miami since I was a child, so I was very familiar with the city. And in 2017, I got an opportunity to accompany an architect to showcase some of his projects here in Miami, a Venezuelan architect. And while I was here, I was, like I said, studying landscape architecture in Venezuela, and I contacted a few firms since I was going to spend here about 3 to 4 months. I contacted some firms to try to do an internship with them to validate it for credits at my master's program in Venezuela. And Sabino Miller was very nice. They were very open. They interviewed me and they allowed me to do a very short internship with them. Adriana Sabino, my boss, she's Venezuelan. She graduated from the same university and the same architecture program where I graduated back home. So she was very familiar. She knew some of my professors. And that's how I kind of created that link with Miami first. And then they started, you know, like seeding the idea, like, why don't you check FIU? At that time, actually my university was closed. There was a big wave of protests in Venezuela in 2017.
So Universidad Central.
So la Universidad Central, it was closed for about 6 months. And I wasn't sure if the program was going to be able to continue. So I applied to FIU during the time that I was here, and it worked out. So I transferred and I finished my master's at FIU, and it was a great experience.
Yeah, well, we're very happy that you did. So tell us a little bit. So your official title is Resilience and Adaptation Lead. Tell us a little bit about that and about the firm in general, the kind of work that you do and the kind of things that you're engaged in on a daily basis.
So Sabino Miller is a multidisciplinary firm. We do architecture, urban planning, and landscape architecture. It's a small firm in Miami, small firm and minority-owned business, but they go for big and challenging projects, which has been really interesting and motivating for me and for our team. So they don't specialize in a specific area. They do many public and private projects. They do residential, commercial, public space, a lot of public space. And in the last few years, they've been honing in more on the resiliency and adaptation projects. They've always had a very big adaptation and resiliency, sustainability components of their projects. They've always been very sensible to nature and how our projects affect our environment. But in the last years, they've been pursuing those type of projects even more. And so this new title, it's brand new from 2024, and it kind of sums up my career development at Sabino Miller. So some of these projects that are back here are resiliency projects. Like I said, I was always very interested in public space. So when I started working at Sabino Miller, I was a lot more interested in the projects that had an impact on our public realm the most. And I'm also, in the past few years, I got sites accredited and I got WEDGE accredited.
Tell us a little bit about that, the waterfront edge design guidelines, right?
The waterfront edge
Insights.
design guidelines from the Waterfront Alliance. That's a group that started in New York, and they started trying to develop a similar rating system to what we know as LEED and sites, but specifically for projects that are on the waterfront edge. So it can be river edge, riverfront, bayfront, oceanfront, and they recently expanded their program to also be on lakes and everything that is waterfront. And it's about bringing sustainability to these projects and nature-based solutions and try to work with nature.
So recently you, in another talk, you, I think, talked a little bit about that, but you also had like a challenge for the field. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so getting certified on this project as a professional or as a project on this rating systems, it's really interesting. It gives you a lot of knowledge and it lays down all the best practices, right? But at the same time, they pose a big challenge because this rating certifications tend to be very complex and very expensive to get. So it's hard to convince clients to go for it, and sometimes even when they want to, they don't have the resources to do it. Usually you have to hire a special consultant. It's not just the architect. It's done through a interdisciplinary team. So not everyone, and definitely not every project, can be a certified project. So my challenge on that talk was, regardless of the final goal of achieving certification, we can, from where we are as designers, try to apply all of these best practices as much as possible. And so that was basically what I was trying to invite people to do.
Yeah. So in some of the projects that you've shared with us here, can you speak about, let's say, the guidelines project? I mean, we have, in our field, we have a broad range of skills and know-how that we can bring to bear. A lot of it is often at the master plan guideline level, and you're very involved in the Bayfront Riverwalk design guidelines, for example, or the master plan for Barnacle. Those two projects stand out. So what was that process like? How much of a departure was that from normal design work? How do you see those projects as fitting into your larger sort of ambitions?
So for me, it's a little bit hard to separate. I have an architect mind because I study architecture first. But like I said, well, as I usually say, I see landscape architecture as an interdisciplinary field. I think that it's really hard to do what we do isolated. And so both of my education both in architecture and landscape architecture had a big urban planning component. And so I think that I approach most projects as those three things at the same time, right? Like as an architect, as an urban planner, and as a landscape architect, which is why I think Sabino and Miller has been such a good fit, because they do those three things. The principals are both either landscape architect and planner, or architect and planner. So it's when I get asked that question, it's a little bit hard for me to divide those things. Just I think they're very interrelated, and just by approaching this project with an integral view, you can get a really good outcome. The funny story is, when I first interviewed with Mary and Adriana, I was studying this master's in landscape architecture in Venezuela, and I was asking them for this internship, and Barry looked me in the eye, and his main question was, why are you switching careers? Like, how? And I was like, am I? I'm not. I was like, well, landscape architecture is a completely different thing than what you do at work in Venezuela. And I was like, I don't think so. I think it's like honing in. It's a specialization, or how I say it in English. But that's how I saw it, right? And now, by practicing landscape architecture in the United States, my vision has shifted, and I completely understand how they're two different things, two different licenses, and everyone has a very important role. But at the same time, I still feel that our work is so interrelated.
And it's great that you get to kind of live and work and do these things in tandem. It's not like a hard, clean break, it seems.
Right.
So what about, you did a great part of your education in architecture, actually all of your architecture education in Venezuela, and some landscape architecture. So clearly that, and you grew up there, right? How do you feel that background informs what you do today, as a landscape architect, being from Venezuela, practicing in Venezuela, studying in Venezuela?
Well, I think what I just answered is a little bit of that. I see the world through a different lens, but also Miami is a good fit because it has such a Latin influence to it. I'm not sure, I mean, I'm sure it influences everything that I do. The way that I relate to other people, the way that I communicate and network, and the way that I approach work and like to go the extra mile. I've heard that that's apparently kind of a Venezuelan thing to do. But yeah, that's it.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think there's obviously a big connection between Miami in particular and Venezuela for many, many years. A big part of the community here, for sure. So you graduated, and then as soon as you graduated, you went from the internship to work with Sabino Miller? Or did you do anything immediately after that?
Graduated FIU in 2019.
FIU, right.
Yes, I started working with them full-time right after
Yeah.
I graduated FIU.
And your experience and your sort of time with them, how has the nature of that work evolved? You know, in that time, you clearly
Right.
you began as an intern, and now you were
Yeah.
senior associate, and now you have this new position.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
It's been a really interesting progression. So I did 2 different internships with them. The first one was this one where I was a completely international student doing something really short, getting to understand how things worked here. But as a volunteer, just, you know, for the credits in Venezuela. And that was a very, very short internship. Then when I was at FIU, I did an internship guided by Ebru with them, and that was towards the end of the program. It counted for some of my credits, and that's where we started creating that link for me to work there after graduation. So it started as an intern, and then I was an associate. We have an associate position, which is right after school, probably 1 to 2, 3 years. And after that, I was promoted to senior associate, and I just recently got promoted to a leadership position.
And in that time frame, can you talk about maybe some memorable projects or, you know, experiences that you've had in that, you know, in how many total years now? Well, since 29, so 5 years, I guess,
Yeah.
right?
5 years as a full-time employee, and a little bit before I did the internship while still studying.
So any projects stand out as particularly important for you,
Yeah.
for your formation, for
Yeah.
your...
So I really enjoy the projects that we do. I'm very proud of the projects that we do, and I find purpose and motivation all the time, so I kind of like all of them. I selected some images of the ones that are most memorable. So the first project I ever worked on it's called Bayshore Park. It actually broke ground this year, and it's the first project that I ever worked on, even briefly on 2017 when I came for the
Tells you
first time.
something. It's a long
Right,
game.
it was in planning back then, and then it broke ground here. I had a very, like a small role on that one, but it's been really interesting to see the progression through those 6 years. And then Baywalk Riverwalk was the first project that I worked full time, and it's been a very interesting, complex project. It started as a guidelines task for the DDA in City of Miami.
Downtown Development Authority.
In the Downtown Development Authority, and we saw it shift from getting done and approved to becoming the City of Miami official waterfront guidelines as part of the Miami 21 building code, and that has been really interesting. it's a planning project, so a lot, since it was the first big project that I worked on, a lot of people ask me like, and when is it getting built, and
Right.
when are we seeing it, and is this project that is going to, I picture me like in 10, 15, 20 years of still coming back to Miami and seeing these little pieces come together, right? And I'm not sure when we'll see the entire waterfront developed as per the guidelines, but we've already seen a few pieces of it, like this necklace of lights.
Which is wonderful.
So that one is really interesting. And then most recently the Barnacle, it's a really good example, but that's a master plan. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to implement it yet. There's also a really interesting project called the Little River, this one actually, the Little River Adaptation Action Area, in which we work with the Office of Resilience from Miami-Dade County to create a municipality program for that area that is, it has a lot of challenges related to climate change. And it was a really interesting effort where we got to stamp on one plan every effort from all of the cities and the counties, different departments, into one integral plan, so that everyone could relate how those things were coming together, what was the timeline, how do we get funding for them, how one project affects the other. And it goes hand in hand with the Miami-Dade County Climate Action Plan. So that has been one of my favorite projects, actually.
And so with the Bayshore project, which began, from the early days until now, do you have a sense of things that have changed, compromises that have been made, successes that you weren't expecting? How has it changed from when you started?
On that project?
Because that's a function of how long so many of these projects take, that players change, funding changes, there's so many reasons for things to take a different course than you began. But so what was your experience with that?
So for me, that's an example of a stubbornness and success, luckily. So if you hear Barry and Adriana talking about that project, it's really inspiring because they tell you the story about how it became as how do you call this? Like they like an advocacy. Yeah, exactly. It became like an advocacy project. So they live in the neighborhood, and they were advocating to create this park for many years, and then when finally the city decided to do it, they advocated a lot for making sure that the park was going to stay as a passive park, right? And then after that, when they got the project and they finally started working on it, they had this vision to make the park a nature-based component to help the stormwater management of the entire neighborhood. And that was a huge challenge. So they designed this lake in the middle of the park, and it's supposed to gather stormwater from the entire neighborhood, get flooded, and then allow that to slowly drain into the groundwater. And that's such a interesting, and that's the project, and this is how it's supposed to work, right? It's a big area. And so when I first started working at Savina Miller, they were trying to convince commissioners and citizens and everyone that this was the right thing to do. And so as an intern, like I said, I had a very small role, but I was working on like creating the right 3D model and creating a video to show people how this was going to work, and more like from a production standpoint, to try to showcase this big vision that they had. And then most of the time after that, I was waiting for like DERM approvals on how this was going to affect water quality and how was it going to get permitted. It was a huge not fight, but yes, it took a lot
A
of
fight.
effort
You could say
um, to make that happen. And well, we're all very proud because it took many months, but we did get term approval, and we got approval from all the commissioners and the city and everyone that had to be involved. So yes, I think 8 years later from the beginning of that project, they're now being able to build it just like they envisioned it.
So, I mean, sometimes when you're working in projects that are like nature-based solutions play a role, or stormwater, they don't necessarily follow one
Right.
jurisdiction, right? It's
Right.
always multiple players if you do it right, right? Because it just the nature of it doesn't care whether this is one city and that's another one. Any experiences or things you can share about that process? How can you best approach a project like that doesn't have like a singular client, where you have many different players? Like, how would you do that?
Well, so you were asking about the Barnacle project, and that's another resiliency and adaptation, that master plan. And for that one, I think it was a very interesting approach as well, because speaking of different agencies and jurisdictions that have to give approval, currently within the Miami-Dade County area, any project that goes into Biscayne Bay is really hard to permit. It's really hard to make it happen for several reasons, which some of them are very valuable because we want to protect Biscayne Bay and all of their seagrass on the bottom of the bay. And so there's a lot that goes into working and permitting on a project like that. But in the case of the Barnacle, I think it was really interesting because what we decided to do was retreating from the bay. So we explained to the client how their site was going to get reduced anyway for sea level rise, right? The bay is encroaching into the site. So we proposed a living shoreline that protects the existing buildings right now and the rest of the site, but from the edge of from the existing edge of the bay into the site instead of building into the bay. And we believe that that's going to make all of the permitting and even the construction a lot easier, and at the end it's going to bring the same result.
So the you, as a student in our program at FIU, and I know that this is true in Venezuela as well, you excelled. You had like a perfect, academic record. You were a model student. If you're comfortable, that obviously, when you become a professional, it's a different ballgame, and there's wins and there's losses, there's successes, there's failures. What are some of those? Can you tell us? And we have students that will be watching this talk and who are here in the audience, so I'm sure they're going to ask you questions, but can you speak about that balance sheet and how you think about these things?
Well, so first I want to correct you because I wasn't, like, as an undergrad student, I wasn't a perfect student.
You heard it here.
I was not. Don't.
What do you mean?
I mean, architecture, landscape architecture, like this field in general is so hard on students. It's so difficult. Like the critiques, the deadlines, like the nights without sleeping and all of that. And also like, yeah, you're figuring out even like what is it that you're supposed to do. So no, first semester's a mess. Don't feel like, but I was very passionate about what I was doing and about what I was learning. So towards the end of the career, I did had a good record with my my architecture thesis project and the last semesters. But I think a part of it is also already understanding better what you're doing and how everything works. Getting more comfortable on what you're supposed to do as a professional. And then all of that gets shattered when you get into the office the first day. Because again, you don't know what
You
you're
don't give
supposed
out
to
A's
do.
and B's and C's.
Right, right. So to be fair, I did have an excellent record as an FIU student. I graduated with a 4.0 GPA, but I did started studying landscape architecture in Venezuela first. So I had a little bit of advantage, like, because when I started, I think both. I had the challenge of, for the first time, studying at a completely different language, taking tests and doing public presentations on a different language, and the cultural differences, right? But at the same time, I was already familiar with the profession and with the means and the materials, and I had had a 5-year career as so architecture is a 5-year course degree in Venezuela. So I had already those 3 plus a little bit that I did as landscape architecture. So it was all really familiar for me at that point, and that's definitely what gave me that kickstart. But at the end of it, just that, like, continue to wanting to learn and being passionate about what you do. I think that's what's behind
Carries you through.
the success, right?
Yeah. And so knowing that, and we'll turn over for the audience here to ask some questions, but what would you, I mean, there's obviously common pitfalls and things as a student. What would you advise them, you know, if you had the benefit of hindsight now and you were, you know, first, second, finishing up, what would you advise the students? What are common good things and, you know, maybe some not so great habits or things? I don't know. So, you know, how would you advise them?
Time management. I think that's like because of how complex the degree is. I think just honing that skill would be one of the advices for sure. With critiques, just don't get crushed by them. I know that's how, you know, how we feel right after, and it's just hard to overcome just facing a critique at any point. But what I would say in hindsight is I remember the more I advanced on my semesters in architecture and landscape architecture, I figured out that I would always remember the bad things that a jury told me during a critique. Like, those were the things that I would really learn. So at the end of the day, you learn a lot through the semester just by developing your project, but those few things that you didn't catch, you kind of like learn them in a fast track moment right there when someone tells it to your face and you realize, like, how didn't I think about this during 4 months? And I would never forget. I would never forget. So it's perfect. It was like, okay, thank you. That was the last piece. So it you know, it kind of ends up being a good thing.
Yeah. Excellent.
And, yeah,
That's great. That's a great answer, and both encouraging and frightening for students.
that's how it works.
That's true. Okay, so we'll have the audience ask questions for a little bit. I have more questions, but I want to allow the students, especially if you have questions too, or anybody really. to chime in.
Can you tell us more about the river walk and the bay walk? That's such an important project for you, an FIU alumni, to be working on that. It's amazing. Can you tell us more about it?
Sure. So the Riverwalk Baywalk project started as a request from the Downtown Development Authority to develop a set of, they called unifying design elements. They just wanted to have like some basic go-to site furniture or materials for developers to pick from a palette and just try to create some consistency throughout this. There's a 25 public easement for every project on the downtown area. That has to be a public easement right next to the water's edge. So they wanted some sense of cohesion through that. And they also wanted to create a branding strategy. So, because a lot of people are not even aware that this easement exists, right? So to bring people to the waterfront and make it a successful public space. And so we did that, but we also made sure to make it an integral guidelines book. And that's why we started using that word, so that the development wasn't just about what material you pick, but it was also about how this space gets designed, how it serves the public and the pedestrian, how it can incorporate sustainability and resiliency elements. And we went even beyond that, and we created some strategies to deal with what happens on the water's edge of right next to that easement, and how can we protect that very important real estate of Miami. So it became a very complex project with a lot of elements, but at the end it did have a branding, signage component. We try to create some placemaking, special elements, and some connections. So part of our job was also evaluating the current state of that easement, where there's connectivity and where there isn't connectivity, and how to bridge those gaps. So it was a very interesting project. And like I said, after that, City of Miami kind of piggybacked on that effort and incorporated it into their waterfront.
I mean, as vulnerable as the water's edge is, it is the most obvious asset that we have. And to think of the continuity and the preciousness of really making sure that we take advantage of that asset and not sacrifice it to chopping it up into all these different zones. Like, it's so important to set up those rules. So I'm really happy that you guys did that.
And to preserve the public access to it.
Absolutely, because so many cities have sacrificed that, just privatizing access to the water. It's a tragedy. Other questions?
What is I don't even know how to word this question, but is there, other than landscape and the public realm, what is maybe an unconventional thing where you find inspiration?
Other than landscape
Other
architecture?
than landscape, other than the public realm, what is something that you get inspiration from?
Okay, so I asked because I think my most honest answer would be nature, and that's so intertwined with landscape architecture. I wanted to make sure that wasn't, but yes, definitely nature. Like the way different ecosystems work, and how is that a system? Like so many things working interrelated to create what we know is true. I can't cease to find inspiration in that.
And if I can add to that, because earlier when I asked about Venezuela, I had the fortune of living in Venezuela as a teen, and the natural world in Venezuela is some of the most powerful and magnificent juxtapositions with civic space, you know? So I think that's in your DNA. I think that's completely a part of, I mean, having lived there as long as you did, I think there's so much power in that natural world. I'm not surprised that would be the inspiration, the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah.
Good question, Milena. Other?
Yeah, just go. I guess travel could be a similar answer, right? Because you go to different places and understand how ecosystems work, like how nature is so different somewhere else. that gives you some perspective too. But just getting immersed in nature somehow, it's
Other questions? Well, I'll pepper in some of my own here, and then if just raise your hand if you
Yeah.
have more. But okay, so travel you mentioned. So if geopolitics, budget, pandemics weren't an issue, where would you like to go next that you haven't been to?
Japan.
Japan.
I would love
Why?
to go to Japan.
Why Japan?
The more I hear about it or see it in TV or something, it just feels like a completely different place. So I'm just so curious about that. From every perspective, from the natural perspective, but from the social perspective. I feel like everything is just so completely different and unknown.
It's a great answer because we have open to alumni, study abroad in Japan in the summers.
I know you did it when I was a student and I couldn't go, so now.
I don't know if this summer, but probably if not this summer, the next one, but definitely in San. But it's open to alumni, and it's true. It's a remarkable place, especially for landscape architecture and design in general. You just everywhere you look, from the simplest, the way a napkin is folded, to the way that food is served, to just the way water is revered. So I think that's a great one for your next destination. All right, some of the more profound questions coming up. What is your favorite meal?
Yeah, I don't know if meal, but I definitely have a super sweet spot for chocolate. Like, can't resist.
Venezuelan cacao is world
Dark
renowned.
chocolate, yes.
Yeah.
Venezuelan cacao, dark
Okay,
chocolate.
so any particular brand that you want to tell us about that you?
Any Venezuelan chocolate.
All right, chocolate. Another great answer. Okay, so far so good. Favorite sound. What's your favorite sound? You have one. Speaking, we have a sound artist in the audience. So this is. I had that question before I met our sound artist in the audience.
Yeah.
So.
Serendipity.
Yeah. I do love the sound of rain. I would, might sound a little standard, but I do love it. And both in Venezuela and in Miami, we have this very strong, like out of nowhere, potent rains. And I just I would stand outside in the porch, just looking at it. Like,
well, the common denominator between those two is that we have horizontal rain.
that's
So I follow, yes, the power, the sublime power.
I did think so. You talked about the artist in the audience. Gustavo Matamoros has some recordings of the sounds of the Everglades, and I did think about that before. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, can't wait to tune into that. All right. So kind of related to Milena's question earlier. Not exactly, but what favorite non-landscape related pastime can you talk to us about? Non-landscape related.
Non-landscape related. Dogs.
Dogs.
I'm extremely
Awesome.
passionate about dogs, yes. I moved to Miami with my 3 dogs.
Wow. Ambitious.
Yeah, and 2 of them were certified emotional support dogs, which took a lot of training, and I love it. I'm very passionate about that. I could spend a lot of time just.
They are quite special. Do you care to share what kinds of dogs? Are they big, small, like what? Breeds? What?
Yeah. So I moved to Miami with 2 labs,
Okay.
best trained, and then before knowing that I was coming to Miami and that I was gonna move at all, we rescued a dog in Venezuela from the street. I couldn't tell you what type of breed. I have no idea. His small little Latin thing from the street.
We have a few of those at home, and I call them 100% love hound.
Right.
That's the breed. All right. What about music? Favorite musician or musical genre?
I don't have one. I thought about it, but
Or several? Like,
so I mean, I enjoy music a lot, but I
Mhm.
couldn't pinpoint one or like either artist or genre.
instruments, singer, voice, everything.
I kind of listen to a little bit of everything. Yeah.
All right. Good.
Nah, that's not my.
What about any visual artists that you're particularly interested in, or
Yes.
whatever? Yeah.
I do admire the Cinetic movement, the Venezuelan Cinetic movement a lot.
Yes.
Because yes, yeah, my favorite one would be Jesus Soto.
Mm-hmm.
There's interactive sculpture at the PAM. If you don't know who Jesus Soto is, but I just heard there's also a very special gallery exhibit here in Linwood until February 29th that I'm yet to go visit, but I will for sure.
Awesome.
Probably
I
next
mean,
week.
and it's I think it's very fitting for design and architecture and landscape.
Yeah.
Their work in particular.
Yeah, and they are everywhere in Caracas, which is my home country. We have a lot of public art,
Mhm.
and a lot of their sculptures are just part of the city, and I grew up seeing it every day, so
Mhm.
really appreciate it.
Mhm. Awesome. All right. So, what about? I mean, we're so overwhelmed, I think, with like opportunities to see things, hear things, read things. Is anything on your current reading list or listening list that's not landscape related?
Yeah, I was gonna say a lot of layer
That's the curveball.
related books that I'm reading.
Oh, right.
nonstop, right?
The landscape
Um,
architecture, yeah, the licensing exam, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that
Sorry.
yeah.
If you could squeeze in one question.
Please, yes.
Yeah.
Alright, this one has to do with landscape architecture, the last one. Let's say there was no restrictions and you had an unlimited budget. What's one thing that you do to Miami that would impact landscape architecture the most?
Good question. Good question.
Public transportation. Yeah, such a good one.
Yes.
Yeah. Like an electric tram rail system or something.
Real public transportation.
Real public
Not just a one
transportation.
way.
That goes
Yeah.
into what Roberto was talking about earlier. So.
So true. That's a great question. I think I'm going to add that to the repertoire.
Yes.
I mean, and it works everywhere else. I mean, you know, good transportation system. Why can't it work here?
More support.
Big cities, you know, good transportation. Great point. So any non-landscape besides the licensing exam, prep books.
I do listen to a lot of audiobooks.
Mhm.
I don't know if everyone knows. I hope everyone knows. But if you have a Miami-Dade County or
The library
Broward,
card, yeah.
library card, you get to get most of those books in a app on your phone.
Libby
so,
is a great app.
Libby, yeah, I
Yeah.
use it a lot. Yes.
Yeah, for free you can get. I mean, sometimes you have to wait, but
Sometimes you have to wait. Yeah, you put a hold, but you put a hold for like a week,
yeah.
and then you get it on your phone.
Mhm.
100% recommended.
Okay, so what's on your Libby list?
Right now, there's what's on my Libby list? I've been reading some books from Brené Brown, which would also
Oh,
go
yeah.
into the podcast list.
Yes,
So.
of course, yeah. About
Yeah.
self-confidence. Tell us about Brené Brown. What's her? I mean, you know, she's become quite popular.
She's become quite popular.
Yeah.
Yep. She's a social worker,
Mhm.
and now she's a consultant for big firms. I discovered her for this Netflix special, I guess, she has about vulnerability, which I think it's really powerful.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, she talks about vulnerability on her to big companies
Mhm.
and to their staff and the importance of it.
Yeah, she's great. And then the TED Talk is wonderful too.
So one of the recent books that I read, it's called Atlas of the Heart.
Mhm.
And for me, it was super useful because it's basically a dictionary. it's a dictionary for emotions.
Mhm.
And a lot of these things, so she talks about how we don't have enough vocabulary to understand our emotions, so we don't have enough vocabulary to express it and to relate to other people from that place.
Mhm.
And I realized that I do have a lot of that vocabulary, but I don't necessarily have it in English.
Mhm.
So it was super interesting just learning about all of these very specific terms
Mhm.
of how you feel, that it's not just like happy or sad or angry. There's so many shades to that.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of words that I had never used in English and that I didn't know how to pinpoint. So
Mhm.
it was
Great suggestion.
Is it Brene Brown?
Brene
Yeah.
Brown.
Okay.
All right. So, any questions? I have one last one. We're close to the hour.
If
here.
you weren't a
Yeah.
landscape architect or a trained architect, what would you be?
Oh, great one. I'm gonna have to add that one too.
what would I be? So, child Patty wanted to be a veterinary, which I guess is why I like nature and wildlife and dogs so much.
Makes sense for the 3 dogs.
Yeah.
That's great. Any vets in your family?
No vets in my family.
Okay.
No. I decided to just follow the grandpa and go,
Great.
too
So
crazy.
this is, as you mentioned earlier, it's a very intense field and discipline and career, really.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think we wouldn't be doing it if we didn't love it. But sometimes we need to pause and we need to disconnect. So what do you do
Yeah.
to disconnect?
I like to DIY at home.
Any cool projects
Which is
happening?
kind of related to architecture, but I definitely don't do it from an architect's standpoint.
To make models at home?
No. I DIY very like improvised. It's not like I will, design a furniture piece and build it and
Mhm.
I just
Go with
do
the
it-
flow.
Yeah. I do it like someone on Instagram would do it.
Right. That's great. I can relate. All right. Well, if there any final things for yes,
Simple question.
Simple
Any
question.
favorite architects from present, past, or movement, or aesthetic?
So definitely Carlos Raúl Villanueva is the master of my architecture upbringing. He's, for those of you that don't know him, he's a Venezuelan landscape architect and he designed the Universidad Central de Venezuela, which is where I was trained. And it's a spectacular campus. It's a, how do you say it in English? Patrimonio de la Humanidad.
so yeah, it's heritage.
Yeah, it's a heritage campus, and it's absolutely
Style,
incredible.
style.
It's a modern campus, yeah, modern architecture from
Most beautiful
the
freeze
50s
block
and
walls.
the
and-
most
yeah.
beautiful it's also tropical architecture, so it's very sensitive to the place, and I think that also has a very important impact on how I approach landscape architecture and architecture. It's an open campus. It definitely works with nature. It's intertwined with art. There's plenty of artists that are part of the architecture and the landscape of the campus. And it's just, like, for me, it's a masterpiece.
It is. I mean, and it's amazing that it's not really that well known, right? It's a little tragic in a way. I mean, outside of
Yeah.
Venezuela or even Latin America, which it reminds me actually. So maybe this is something for a passion project for you later on. But on April 9th, we have our second spring session, and one of our alums, Margarita Blanco, just finished a book on Suarez, who was the landscape architect. He's from Colombia, who was really integral to designing Vizcaya. And she got all the archives and all that, and now there's a book. And so I think we need to get more of these names out here in the mainstream because it's really remarkable work.
Yeah.
Great question. Awesome. All right, Patricia. Well, let's give Patricia a big round of applause. Thanks for being a part of the series and for being such a wonderful role model for our students and program.
Thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.